an opportunity now to ask Professor Simeon Yates and his colleagues to give us an update. This is very exciting, to give us an update on the work on the minimum digital living standard for Wales and the report that has been submitted to Welsh Government. So, Simeon.
So, hi everybody. I'm going to be doing this as a multi-member team presentation with Catherine and Chloe from Loughborough, and we hope Emma from Good Things, though this being a digital inclusion meeting and Emma is having connection difficulties. So if not, I will step in and try and cover the bits that Emma was going to cover. We're going to try and keep to time. I know we're a bit short on time. So Catherine has kindly said she would be the person to share slides.
The look of alarm on Catherine's face as you said that. Oh, there, okay, good, right.
Right, so I'm just going to do 2 seconds of scene setting. If we could get to the first slide, and then hopefully Emma and Chloe will talk you through the real detail of all of the field work that the Loughborough team has done to build this. And then we'll talk a little bit about what's next, both for Wales and for the Nuffield funded Minimum Digital Living Standards project, and plug our meeting next Wednesday when we'll be doing the proper full national launch for this. The websites for all of our organisations and for the project are up, and they've all got the reports on them. So if you want to read these reports, we'll distribute the web links after the meeting. So just to remind why this came about, a group of us started thinking about a minimum digital living standard about 4 years ago. In fact, I will remind Emma it was kind of her idea. Then we chased down some funding to try and develop one. Through a slightly longer process, we got funding from the Nuffield Foundation to develop a national minimum digital living standard. In all of those conversations about what was needed, one of our partners then, Carnegie Trust, I think, had talked to the Welsh Government and others, and the Welsh Government wanted a minimum digital living standard, which was really cool because the idea had traction. And we've been commissioned by the Welsh Government to work with Compass and with this network and others to look at what a minimum digital living standard would be for Wales, and also to talk to stakeholders about how they might make use of that if it's brought into policy or it's put into place in Wales. We're at the stage now where we've done the first phase of the Welsh project, which was to deliver the Welsh minimum digital living standard and the stakeholder discussion. And nationally, we've delivered the minimum digital living standards for the UK households with children. Our next steps, which I'll speak about later, are about looking at this now in terms of more quantitative work, but also more detailed work with individual groups and stakeholders. So I am going to pass over to Catherine and Chloe.
Hi, I believe it's me next, Chloe. Yeah, so this is the definition of a minimum digital living standard that we developed with members of the public, and I'll talk to the methodology in a moment. So it's really important that, as I think Emma mentioned earlier, this is a really holistic view of what a minimum digital living standard should be. So a minimum digital standard of living includes, but is more than, having accessible internet, adequate equipment, and the skills, knowledge, and support people need. It's about being able to communicate, connect, and engage with opportunities safely and with confidence. Next slide, please. So if I just take a step back for a moment, we share some key principles. The MDLS project shares some key principles with a well-established minimum income standard method that has been going since 2006. And some of these key principles, for example, we're interested in individual needs, but we're interested in how these needs interact at a household level. So you can see how this is useful then for understanding also digital needs, not just income standards and so on. We're also interested in what the public identify as digital needs. So this is very much bottom up as opposed to top down. And finally, just another thing to highlight is that this method is built upon a series of deliberative focus groups with these members of the general public. So we bring together people from different backgrounds and circumstances, but ultimately they're from similar household types. So in this case, we were interested in families raising children. So we conducted focus groups. We ensured that we talked to parents and that we talked to young people. But also in our orientation group stage, we included a wider range of people, including people of pension age. The reason for that is because in that first stage, the orientation stage of research, that's where we developed the minimum digital living standard definition. So on the one hand, we have the definition that we develop with members of the public. On the other hand, then we have these stages 2, 3 and 4, these groups, where once we have that definition, we can then ask people, okay, what is the MDLS contents then to meet that definition? So very, very different tasks in mind, and they help us to deliberate on the different goods, services and skills for meeting the different components of that MDLS definition. We had lots of groups with people for the UK-wide MDLS, and then more specifically, we wanted to look at Wales. So we fed through the contents and definition from UK MDLS, and we wanted to check its relevance. Is this relevant? Is it still adequate and appropriate for families in Wales? Are there any specific needs, any specific barriers? Next slide, please. So what this visual shows us on the right, and we do have this in our report, which I encourage you to go and look at. This shows you at a glance the principle of MDLS, sorry, not what's just in the definition, but the contents as well. So while on the one hand you have those foundational things, so those things at the foundation of the house, we have the devices and the connection. Having these devices, having the connection, being online, the whole point of that is what can you then use that for? As we know that there's increasing prevalence of services, vital services moving online. So people talked a lot about that. What are these things enabling us to do, and what skills do you then need? What practical and functional skills do you need? And then importantly, once you're online and engaging in these services, what things do you need to be aware of in terms of understanding and managing different digital risks as a result of interacting with people online, sharing and receiving information, and so on. We have a lovely quote from one of our group participants, which demonstrates at that point in time when we were developing the MDLS definition, how this has to be holistic, but I don't think I have time to read it out to you, I'm very sorry. So I'll point us to the next slide. For your information as well, and I can't go into all of this, but this is in the MDLS Wales report as well. And this is the house, but in much more detail. So we've got all of those components. If the definition of MDLS is to be able to have the goods, the services, the skills, the knowledge and the support, then what does that actually look like? And this here is a figure that we have in our report, which lays out in detail what exactly did groups with members of the public mean when they talked about managing and monitoring your digital devices, and what is for whom. And we also break it down by age and stage of the child at which they might need to begin developing certain skills. But the assumption of groups was that parents would need all of the skills within the household. So that's all I have time for, but I'll pass on to Catherine Hill now, my colleague.
So I'm just going to say very briefly, because I'm conscious of time, a few of the findings that came out from the groups that we spoke to in Wales. So we presented, as Chloe said, the definition, the contents. Groups confirmed that these were appropriate for Wales. They didn't make any changes to the overall list of goods, services and skills. There were discussions about issues though which could affect people's abilities to meet the threshold, especially infrastructure, for example, but rather than feeling that the needs themselves should change. So a few specific points, which I think reflected in the stakeholder research as well, which we did. These are not necessarily specific to Wales. Some do relate to sort of rural geographic areas, which may well occur in other parts of the UK as well. The main UK research we did was in urban households, but just flagging up these issues that were raised with the groups in Wales. One was about home broadband speed, connection, and reliability of home broadband. There was talked about not being a choice in rural areas, not just rural areas, but also housing someone, you know, in Cardiff, even if it's to do with their thick walls or something like that. But it meant that they couldn't do what the family needed to do, which we say in MDLS, people should be able to use devices at the same time. So there were compromises around that. The implications were financial implications. People talked about feeling forced to upgrade and having to pay more for super fast broadband because the standard couldn't cope with it. They were getting less speed than was advertised. Having to use mobile data, you know, if they couldn't use it upstairs, for example, couldn't get Wi-Fi, so having to use your mobile data, which has implications for the amount of data that you might need. And people just feeling aggrieved that you're still paying for something that you're not getting. And the other aspect is affordability. Social tariffs were mentioned, and if they weren't considered sufficient enough, they said they felt that it needs to be a low price tariff, but it's got to be fit for purpose. And the other thing is a loyalty premium was raised quite a bit, that you shouldn't really have to haggle at the end of your term. Patchy mobile data coverage was something that came up in the Welsh groups, more so than the urban groups in England, particularly rural, but also in urban areas as well, which causes difficulties when out and about, because being able to access mobile data was a really important part of MDLS. And just briefly on skills, again, this isn't necessarily strictly related to Wales because the same things come up in the UK report, but also improving digital skills. Parents particularly felt that they could do with improving digital skills, but there was a sort of lack of awareness about where to go, how to get started, a bit overwhelmed by where you get information, little awareness of formal support. Maybe if you're a pensioner or if you're unemployed, they thought there might be something. Other than that, people sort of turned to schools or their own children, as outlined by somebody in this quote. The other issue was time for parents. If you don't know where to start, you know, just sort of looking for information, and also deciphering what information to trust as well. And the other aspect was concerns around digital harms and skills and digital risks and harms, especially because we're talking to parents about children. A real general feeling there should be more awareness raising, should be more campaigns, and there's a sort of broad responsibility for this. I talked about service providers, social media companies being involved, They felt it'd be good to have an overarching body for guidance, information and monitoring role. Weren't sure who that might be, but it needs to be trustworthy, with sort of mixed views about whether the government, what role they should play in that. So I'll just pass back over to Sim.
Thanks, Catherine. I think one of the important things to stress about the MDLS is, as Chloe said, it's households and themselves that have generated this. It's not a list of I wants, it's a list of what people think a household needs. And it's not survival need. It's not like enough internet to basically do things. It is, what does a household need to have a minimum reasonable digital living standard? You know, so that if you drop below this, you may still be able to do various functional things online, but not all. So you are therefore starting to be, you're starting to suffer levels of inequality compared to others about what you can do as a citizen compared to the rest. And you're falling below that minimum that gives you the basics of all the things you need. And importantly, that it's, what I think is really important is the interplay between the mobile and broadband, that it's not just one or the other, and that just having mobile is I think, it is the absolute baseline. It's like your minimum wage or your basic universal credit type income. It's enough to do some stuff, but it's not enough to do everything. And so I think there's an important thing there about the ability to balance good quality access and the importance of some of mobility, which I think has an important issue for Wales more than some other areas of the UK, because that balance between those two infrastructures is a challenge in some areas and so on. We also talked to stakeholders about an MDLS as we were developing it. So some key things that came up in those discussions. Many of you on the call were part of that stakeholder engagement, so thank you for your time on that. I mean, it was welcomed and valued, which is great. And most people we spoke to thought that it would be able to enhance either their own work or their work with the Welsh Government. Things that came through talking to stakeholders, affordability was a key issue. Now you will note that we don't put affordability in the MDLS definition. We don't say affordable internet, because actually that's a barrier that needs to be solved, not a need. You know, if the need is broadband such that everyone in the house, you know, parents, children can access the internet to do the things they need, and that internet cost is too high or social tariffs don't work, that's a barrier to be solved, not a need in itself. So I think there was quite a lot of concern about affordability and maybe more so than maybe some other discussions we've had in Wales. Obviously, Welsh language came in, and the importance of ensuring that Welsh language issues were not an afterthought in the design and delivery of services and digital access. Rurality, as has already been mentioned, poor connectivity speeds was again identified as a barrier to being able to deliver the MDLS. Diversity of groups and cultural groups and so on across Wales was also raised as an area to look at to see how the MDLS was specific to them, and I'll talk to next steps, which partly addresses that. And then the question was also, you know, what resources and support does Wales have? This fantastic digital inclusion network, you know, that doesn't exist except in one or two other spots in the UK, maybe in Scotland and Manchester and a few other places around Britain, where a large group of stakeholders comes together to address digital inclusion. That's a resource for addressing some of these barriers. Go to the next slide, please. So obviously, as been mentioned by Emma earlier, this is fantastic that a Welsh MDLS is priority 5 in the agenda for the Digital Inclusion Alliance. You know, and therefore, from the stakeholder conversations we had, you know, that there was an expression that would be a need to be both financial and political commitment to an MDLS to make it work. Excuse me. Some clear and targeted communication so that people understand what it is and what it can do, can't do, etc. And thinking about how you look at the barriers that people have to an MDLS and then how you put strategies together that would address those for the communities that you are working with, rather than maybe, you know, blanket across the piece. Some stakeholders did say that they felt that Wales was lagging behind in some of these things, especially the infrastructure rollout. There may be some perceptual things of that, because I can point to some other parts of the UK where that's also very much the case, both urban and rural. But I think it's also important to understand where people see themselves and where the challenges that they can identify themselves are, and that you work with those, and so on. And we've reflected these in some of the recommendations that we've put in the summary for the report. Could I have the next slide, please? Right. So next steps. We're very thankful that the Welsh Government is providing us with some phase 2 funding. This will involve looking at talking to either citizens or their stakeholder representatives for groups that we can identify as falling below the MDLS, to understand what the implications of that are for them, what they think are the barriers to them achieving the MDLS, and how those kind of conversations might then fall out to both policy recommendations, but also maybe specific intervention opportunities for communities in Wales. Our big UK National Minimum Digital Living Standard project continues. This is funded by Nuffield Foundation and Nominate. Our next task that we're in the midst of at the moment is trying to design a survey that will allow us to kind of quantify, or at least identify, households, household types, and so on that are falling below the MDLS, sort of demographically and so on. We're working with some geographers and hope to geodemographically map it. It's not as straightforward as we might have thought. It's a challenge to turn the definition into something that's easily quantifiable, but we're working on that. And we'll also be talking to stakeholders again from specific communities across the UK, e.g. people with disabilities, to see what a specific MDLS for a household, say with someone who's a disabled person in it, might be different from a household without. I think it's important to say the MDLS is not a number. It's not, oh, if you've got 67 megabit broadband and 2 laptops, you are in the MDLS. If you read it carefully, it's that mix of kit, skills, confidence, etc. But also, we've done one for households with children. We've expanded a little bit by talking to rural people and so on in Wales, and found that they don't see a need to massively change it, but they've identified barriers to meeting it. But what an MDLS might be for a single disabled person, or a couple who are, you know, older adults in their 70s, will be different in terms of the basket of goods, not necessarily the definitions. And that's some of the future work that we want to do, is look at those other household types in the future. And last big plug, next week, we will be launching the reports formally. We've got an event on the 15th of March. If you've not had an invite already, I think it's just been put in the chat. Please sign up. It's on Zoom. You don't have to brave the snow or the London smog to come and attend. You will see much of what you've seen today, but maybe in a little more detail. And you're more than welcome to come and attend. There's the reports. If you've got any questions, please email me or Catherine or Chloe at Loughborough, and we'll be more than happy to fill you in, because that was very much a rapid rattle through. Thank you.
Simeon and colleagues, thank you so much. That it's such an exciting and important piece of work, this, and it's great that the Alliance has been a key part of it and helping to inform it.